Someone once has said, "A happy child uses their childhood to embrace life, while an unhappy child has to spend their whole life healing from it." But have you ever wondered, who will be there with those children on their journey of healing? Not everyone is lucky enough to have arms waiting for them after every fall. Some children fall, and the whole world just watches. Some children are never called by their name, only seen as leftover objects, barely surviving amidst pain, cold, and abuse. And in this story, it begins in a cold forest, under a pouring rain, where a little girl, abandoned and covered in wounds, lay curled up as if the entire earth had forgotten her existence. Fortunately, she encountered the only light in her life at the end of that darkness. That was Elliot Grayson, 50 years old, a self-made billionaire in the real estate industry. People called him the eccentric billionaire, the faceless man of Wall Street, or the ghost of the real estate world. In financial articles, his name was always accompanied by cold numbers, net worth in the tens of billions, massive deals, skyscrapers bearing his signature style. But no one knew that every night, when all the offices turned off their lights and contracts were finalized, Elliot would return to a mansion as silent as a grave. There was no laughter there, no trace of children's footsteps, not a single person waiting behind the door. On the largest wall in the living room, there was only one photograph, a blurry image of a woman, maybe his mother, or maybe someone who once loved him. The photo was so old that no features were clearly visible, but he still hung it in the most prominent place, as if clinging to the last surviving piece of memory. He had no family, no wife, no children, and no relatives. Only one habit. Every afternoon, he would sit by the large window, his eyes looking out at the garden filled with withered trees, as if searching for something lost a long time ago. Those who worked with him always said, "That man has no heart." But they didn't know who truly has no heart. There are just some people still trying to gather the shattered pieces of theirs. That March, Elliot came to Asheville, a small town in the southern United States, to survey a site for building a shelter for orphans and abused women. Throughout the entire survey, except when the project manager reported on the site's progress, there wasn't a single personal conversation. Suddenly, a young staffer spoke up and asked Elliot, "Sir, this project hasn't been publicly announced and no one knows about it. Why is that?" The manager quickly interrupted and said to Elliot, "I'm sorry, sir, he's new." Elliot quietly looked at the young man and replied softly, "It's just an unpaid debt from the past." Then he walked away without giving any further explanation. Everyone was left puzzled by his answer. Elliot was actually once an orphan. He was abandoned in a dumpster behind a market, without a name, without anyone claiming him, without anyone wanting him. A street sweeper found him and brought him to an orphanage, where every night he had to pretend to be asleep just so he wouldn't hear the cries of other children. Where every morning he didn't dare look into the eyes of adults for fear that one day they would choose someone, but not him. He grew up under pitiful gazes, half-hearted hugs, and promises that were never kept. Then one day, he ran away. He wandered, stole food to survive, slept in train stations, was chased and beaten. But it was from that pit of hunger and fear that Elliot figured out how to climb the ladder of life, with scarred hands and an unyielding determination never to be discarded again. He succeeded, but the price was a childhood that had been stolen forever. And even now, though he had everything, Elliot's heart remained a cold room no one had ever knocked on. That afternoon in Asheville, the sky was heavy, as if draped in mourning. Elliot had just finished surveying a remote plot of land on the outskirts of town, where he intended to build a shelter amidst nature. On the way back, instead of heading straight to his car, he paused on a small path leading into the forest. There was something that urged him forward, a silent kind of feeling, inexplicable, but very real. The wind whispered softly through the leaves, shaking the dry branches like the rib bones of a barren forest. Elliot walked deeper in, his feet heavy with cold, wet mud. Then he stopped, because of a faint, broken bark from somewhere far away, mixed with the clanking sound of something hitting metal. The barking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so absolute he could hear his own heartbeat. He pushed past a thick bush, and in that very moment it felt like his heart stopped beating. A little girl, so small she looked as though a gust of wind could carry her away, was lying motionless among the patchy weeds that grew like old scars upon the earth. Her thin shirt was torn to shreds, clinging to a frame that was nothing but skin and bone. Her hair had lost all shape, matted into clumps like a bird's nest, buried in mud after a storm. Her skin was ashen, covered in bruises and mud. No sign of reaction, no movement, but it was her eyes, those wide-open eyes, that squeezed Elliot's heart. They weren't the eyes of a frightened child. They weren't begging. They weren't terrified. They were hollow, so hollow that even tears seemed too heavy to fall. A dark, bottomless pit where light could no longer reach. Just a void, a place where every last shred of hope had been crushed so long ago that even the child herself no longer remembered who she was. Elliot stood frozen. He had seen war, had walked past corpses, had witnessed lives shattered by tragedy, but never before had he seen such desolate, silent pain. A soul erased of identity, no name, not even a voice left to cry out in pain. In that brief moment, Elliot saw himself as a child, reflected in the shattered mirror of memory. Without asking, he immediately stepped forward and knelt down. His hands trembled in shock as he gently placed one on her shoulder. "My child," he whispered, as if speaking to a fragile shadow, afraid that even breathing too loudly would make her disappear. "Can you hear me? Sweetheart, are you still alive?" No answer. Only the faint rise and fall of a weak breath beneath the torn fabric. Suddenly, a gruff male voice barked behind him. "What the hell are you doing over there?" Elliot turned around. It was a large man, unshaven, sun-scorched skin like worn leather, emerging from the edge of the forest. In his left hand was a beer can. Hanging from his hip was something that looked like a gun, rusted but still threatening. He staggered closer, reeking of alcohol, sneering. "She is mine. Back off, you bastard." His words landed like punches to Elliot's chest. Elliot clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "You left her here alone, in this cold. You're her father." She kept crying, so I punished her a bit. "She's not gonna die, relax." The man smirked, taking a drag from his cigarette and blowing smoke into Elliot's face. A slow, cold, and steady anger began to rise in Elliot. It didn't explode, but it burned deep and sharp. He bent down and gently lifted the little girl into his arms. Her frail body curled up, trembling like a fledgling that had lost its nest. "I can't leave her here." His voice was low, even, but sharp as a blade. "What are you doing? Trying to steal my kid?" The man glared, his right hand slowly reaching for the gun at his waist. "I'm trying to save her." The man stepped forward. His eyes darkened. His breath reeked of beer. His wrist twitched, as if teetering between hitting and holding back. Elliot didn't move, but held the child tighter. From a distance, Elliot's assistant appeared between the tall trees, his face pale with fear. He scanned the scene quickly, his gaze resting longer on the child's face. Without saying a word, he stepped back a few paces, pulled out his phone, and turned his back to the forest. "Police, Please come quickly. There's an abandoned child here, and a man with a weapon." Just a few minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the silence. 2 police cars arrived, flashing lights sweeping through the trees. The man jolted, stepping back, his arm falling limp. "God damn it! Who the hell called them here?" Elliot didn't answer. He just held the child tighter in his arms. The police stepped out, hands on their belts. "Drop your weapon, hands behind your head. Don't move." The man resisted, cursed loudly, then staggered backward, realizing he couldn't escape. Another officer ran over to Elliot. "Sir, are you all right? How's the little girl?" Elliot gave a slight nod, his voice tight with emotion. "She's alive, but she needs a doctor." As soon as possible, police immediately called for an ambulance. The assistant approached, eyes full of worry. Elliot turned to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and nodded gently. "Well done. Thank you for coming back." The police handcuffed the man and led him away. He growled like a wild animal being subdued, glancing menacingly at the child. The ambulance arrived. Elliot gently placed the little girl on the stretcher. Before the door closed, a small, thin, trembling hand slowly reached out. Her fingers clutched the edge of his coat, so weak that it was barely a touch. Yet it stopped Elliot in his tracks. He looked down, and in that hand, he didn't just see the fear of being left behind, but all the trust a child had just begun to find again. The girl couldn't speak. She just tried to look at him with all her strength, but her eyes couldn't stay open. Her eyelids fluttered, then softly closed. Her breathing grew steady. She fainted. Elliot remained where he was, unmoving. A medic was about to invite him onto the ambulance, but he simply shook his head. "Take her to the best hospital. I'll handle all the costs." The door shut. The lights spun once more. The vehicle disappeared into the fog. Elliot stood there for a few more seconds, his hand still feeling the tiny grip of hers. The assistant stepped beside him. 2 men, saying nothing. Only when the sound of sirens faded did Elliot finally say, "Let's go home." After being admitted to the hospital, the doctors finally learned the little girl's name. Lily. She was only 9 years old, a name so gentle, so innocent. It felt almost cruel when contrasted with the horrors she had endured. At first, the investigative team assumed this was simply a severe case of child abuse. Outrageous, yes, but not unprecedented. But it wasn't just that. As medical reports were released one by one, as testimonies from nurses, doctors, and neighbors began to surface, a more horrifying truth gradually came to light, one that chilled even the most seasoned professionals to the bone. Lily had never been treated like a child. No one had ever held her in their arms. No one had called her by her name with any trace of affection. She had no bed, no toys, no birthday. She was never sent to school. To her stepfather, Lily wasn't a daughter. She was a nuisance, a burden, perhaps just a poorly trained puppy. She was locked in a damp, windowless room in the basement where not even sunlight dared to reach. No lamp, no warmth, no kindness. Every day, she was given a small piece of stale bread or a half-rotted sausage, tossed through the crack beneath the door as if feeding an animal. On some days, the man forgot to feed her. On others, he remembered, but instead of food, he came bearing a rope, an electric baton, or fists full of rage. No reason, or worse, no reason was ever needed. A young nurse broke down in tears after reviewing Lily's x-rays. Her voice trembled as she said, her ribs were fractured, at least 3 different breaks. None were treated. Some had healed incorrectly and were pressing into her lungs. She has keloid scars on the soles of her feet, likely from being forced to walk barefoot on gravel or burning surfaces. What's most terrifying is, These injuries aren't new. They date back months, maybe years. A pediatrician, after studying her blood test results, could only sigh quietly in disbelief. She's severely deficient in iron, protein, and vitamin D. Her level of malnutrition is comparable to that of a child in a famine-stricken refugee camp. Her stomach has shrunk, and she can't digest normal portions. Her reflexes for chewing and swallowing are almost gone. She doesn't know what eating is. She doesn't know what fullness feels like. She didn't even know how to be loved. An elderly woman who lived 3 houses down recounted her memories through tears. I never saw that girl smile. I don't even remember hearing her speak. She never left the house unless her stepfather was with her. And every time she did, she had bruises all over her face and red rope marks around her wrists. I once asked him about it, and he just chuckled and said, "If you don't discipline a puppy early, it'll bite. I'm just training her." I thought he was joking. I didn't think he meant it. But he did. He truly saw her as nothing more than an animal. Lily had a mother once, but barely remembered her. The woman had long since vanished, left one day, and never came back, abandoning her daughter to the man she herself had refused to live with. Lily had no one to run to when she was scared. No one to call for help. Every footstep in the house was a warning. Every nightfall wasn't a lullaby. It was a threat. She could be beaten at any moment, for any reason, or no reason at all. A shopkeeper from a small grocery store near Lily's home told journalists about one haunting incident. One day, the girl tiptoed into my store, voice barely audible. "Ma'am, may I please have an apple?" I said no. I didn't want to start a habit. Figured if I gave her one, she'd come back again. A few hours later, she came back. Her face was swollen. Her hands were scratched and bleeding, her sleeves soaked in blood. She didn't ask to eat anymore. She just whispered, "If I don't ask, would you let me borrow it instead? I don't need to eat it. I just want to hold it, so I won't get beaten again." She had learned that if she tried too hard, she would be punished. If she dared to speak, she would be hurt. If she drew attention to herself, she would become a target. So Lily learned how not to exist. She learned how to be invisible, how to survive like a shadow. In fact, Lily had been reported to the police at least once. But because no shelter would take her in, no center willing to care for a child like her, she was returned to the very place that had devoured her childhood like a silent prison. Elliot had read the full investigation file. One sleepless night, he sat at his desk, coffee long cold in his cup, eyes fixed on the hospital report. 3 fractured ribs, ligature marks on her wrists, severely disrupted neural responses, prolonged anxiety episodes, mutism caused by emotional trauma. At the very bottom of the file, a handwritten note from the head physician read, "This is not just a victim of abuse. This is a child who has been stripped of her right to be human." It was that line that made Elliot unable to sit still. He had once believed he'd seen every form of cruelty the world had to offer. Billion-dollar lawsuits, betrayals for power, ruthless takeovers by people willing to trample anything and anyone in their path. But never, not once, had he witnessed a crime so vile that it robbed a child of her very identity, a crime that trained a human soul to believe it was undeserving of even being treated as one. Soon after, thanks to Elliot's determined intervention, Lily's stepfather, the man who had haunted her every breath, was arrested and charged with multiple crimes: child abuse, illegal possession of weapons, unauthorized logging operations, and, most disturbingly, involvement in a transnational smuggling ring that had destabilized several border regions. The trial moved swiftly, the charges stacked beyond dispute. But the scars he left on Lily's body, on her heart, would take far longer than any sentence to heal. Days later, Lily's story began appearing in newspapers across the country, a miracle child who had survived the darkness, saved by the compassion of a mysterious billionaire. But Elliot paid no attention to the news. He didn't show up in public, didn't answer questions from journalists. He did only one thing: ask his assistant the same questions every day. Did she eat? Did she sleep well? Has she started talking yet? Every day, those same 3 questions. And every day, the same 3 shakes of the head. The girl remained silent, as if the horrors had stolen not just her voice, but her belief that it was safe to use it. Until one drizzling afternoon, while Elliot was reviewing a newly signed charity contract with a boarding school, his assistant quietly walked in and handed him a crumpled piece of paper. Elliot looked surprised and asked, "What is this?" The assistant simply smiled and said, "A gift, sir." Elliot opened it. It was a drawing. Clumsy, the pencil marks blurred by water, but he understood it instantly. A child stood in the rain. Her hair was messy, her body shivering from the cold. Beside her was a man, faceless, but his hands were shown placing a coat over the girl's shoulders. In the distance, a house with glowing windows and an open door, as if waiting for someone to arrive. The paper slipped from Elliot's fingers. He sat still. The room suddenly became silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath. That night, he couldn't sleep. He dozed off in his chair and began to dream. In the dream, he was 7 again, a small boy, soaked to the bone, standing huddled under the roof of an old bus stop. Rain lashed against his face, biting cold. A man walked by and paused for a moment, then kept walking, leaving the boy alone in the dark. Elliot jolted awake. Cold sweat soaked the back of his shirt. The soft yellow glow of the nightlight made the room seem to tremble with him. He couldn't let another child relive that nightmare. Not ever again. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and whispered hoarsely in the dark, "If I once wished someone would save me, then now I will be that someone." Without hesitation, he stood, put on his coat, and called his assistant. "Tomorrow, we're bringing the girl home." The next morning, as soon as the shelter opened its doors, Elliot was already standing in the main lobby. His usually crisp, expensive suit was rumpled. His hair was unkempt. Dark circles hung under his eyes, his gaze weary from a sleepless night. And yet, in that exhausted appearance, there was something unshakable. He didn't explain his reason, didn't mention his status. He just quietly said one sentence: "I'm taking the girl home." No one dared object. The shelter manager proposed temporary procedures and asked him to review the documents. But Elliot simply picked up the pen and signed, as if it wasn't a legal form, but a blood pact between a man who'd once been left behind in the rain and a girl just beginning to relearn how to exist in a world that had nearly erased her. When the black car silently rolled through the mansion gates, Lily sat in the back seat without saying a word. She held tightly to a worn-out stuffed rabbit, a gift from one of the shelter staff at the time of farewell. Her eyes stayed fixed on the car window, watching every passing branch, as if searching for something that had been lost forever. Elliot's house had once been a symbol of success, power, and high society standards. But today, it looked more like a castle stripped of laughter. A place dazzling on the outside, but silent within, like a shelter that had forgotten how to feel warm. The small room on the second floor had already been prepared. His assistant had chosen pastel pink for the walls, bought adorable stuffed animals, and hung tiny dresses neatly on a wooden rack. Elliot didn't know what children needed, but he knew what he had once needed. And now, he was trying to become what he had never had. Yet in that house, they existed like two shadows. By day, Elliot sat in his study. Soft light filtered through the skylight, and fell across the old wooden desk. Papers lay scattered, but he didn't touch them. His hand rested near the remote, sometimes switching on the monitor connected to Lily's room, not to supervise, but simply to see that she was still there, curled up by the window, scribbling or holding a pillow for a long time. He didn't know how to start a conversation, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood wounds, if touched the wrong way, would only bleed more. Every evening, he cooked dinner himself, nothing elaborate, warm cream soup, crispy bread, sometimes a boiled egg clumsily shaped like a rabbit. Elliot had never cooked for anyone before, but now his hands were learning how to season, not just with spices, but with the longing of a child who had once craved a meal not thrown at him. He would knock lightly on her door, placing the tray down. "I made a little food, if you're hungry." There was no reply. Only when he turned to leave would the door creak open slightly. A small hand would reach out and gently pull the tray inside. Lily ate very little, just a few spoonfuls of soup, a piece of bread, then left the tray exactly as it was. Elliot would quietly pick it up. Every night was the same. He said nothing, but his heart grew heavier. Lily's door never slammed shut, but in his mind it echoed like the lock of a childhood memory. Night fell. The house grew even more silent. No TV sounds, no footsteps of house staff, only faint noises, stealthy footsteps in the hallway, the soft touch of a hand brushing against the wooden wall, as if the child was trying not to disturb the world. One night, Elliot woke up thirsty. When he stepped into the open kitchen, he stopped in his tracks. The soft light from the night lamp glowed across the corner of a chair. Lily sat there, curled up like a fallen leaf, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her eyes were closed, but her eyelashes were wet with tears. He didn't call out, didn't walk over. He simply poured some milk, warmed it, and placed it on the nearby table. Not a sound was made, but his heart tightened. Some children are born so used to the cold that they don't dare believe a warm glass of milk could come from genuine kindness. And some adults, who had once craved warmth so deeply, when given the chance to offer it, did so with every last piece of their heart. That afternoon, the rain was pouring hard. The cold rain sliced through the thick walls of the Grayson mansion. The sky was a dull grey. Wind slid through the window frames like sighs without names. Elliot was standing in his study, eyes fixed on the blueprint on his desk, but his mind had drifted somewhere far away, refusing to return. Then, a very faint sound echoed from the hallway behind, like careful footsteps, followed by the dripping of water onto wooden floors. He stepped out, following the hall, and froze in front of the doorway. Lily, soaked from head to toe, was cradling a tiny creature in her arms. Her hair clung to her skin, her dress smeared with mud. She held a skinny stray dog that looked like a shadow pulled from the rain, its fur spiked from the cold, its dull eyes faintly pleading. She hadn't seen him. She crouched down quietly, pulling an old towel from her backpack and gently wiping the dog's back. Her movements were slow, tender, but hurried, as if every second delayed might steal away the creature's last bit of warmth. She made a nest out of an old sweater, then rummaged through her bag and pulled out a dried piece of sausage, tucking it gently into its mouth. And she whispered, barely audible, like holding her breath, "Don't bark. Here, silence is safety. It means survival." Elliot heard it all. He took one more step. The wooden floor creaked softly. Lily startled. She turned sharply, her eyes wide with panic, like a cornered animal. She instantly stepped in front of the dog, arms outstretched, her tiny frame trembling. "Are you going to send him away?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it shook so much it felt like it could dissolve into the rain outside. Elliot looked at the girl, then at the dog, small, soaked, so skinny that every rib showed beneath its fur. Its eyes looked exactly like Lily's the first day he saw her, not begging for salvation, just pleading to be seen by someone who wouldn't hurt it. He sighed. The tense look on his face gradually softened. "I don't want any more trouble in this house." The words were gentle, but they sliced through the fragile air between them like a blade. Lily lowered her head. Her arms still clung tight. He turned and started walking away. But before he reached the doorway, the voice of his assistant, a young woman who often kept an eye on Lily, quietly spoke. "Mr. Grayson, sometimes the thing that connects two broken hearts isn't even human." He stood still, then walked on without a word. That night, the kitchen glowed with a soft yellow light from the vintage pendant lamp overhead. Elliot stood there, holding a clean towel, beside a bowl of warm milk still steaming. He didn't know how much the dog would drink, but he remembered when he was once so hungry he didn't even have the strength to cry. The only thing he had was half a cup of milk from an old woman whose name he couldn't recall. He carried the tray downstairs to the laundry room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Lily sat curled up in a corner, wrapping a blanket around the dog. Shadow, the name they would later give it, was nestled against her chest, breathing weakly but steadily. Elliot didn't knock. He just placed the tray on the floor. On it, a bowl of milk and a dry towel. Not a word. The little girl didn't see him. She quietly crouched down, carefully laying an old, worn sweater on the floor, every motion deliberate, as though she were afraid of hurting even the air around her. The sweater was far too thin to shield against the cold, creeping through the damp cracks of the tiled floor. But still, she patiently folded its edges, smoothed its surface, then gently placed the soaked dog down onto it. As if laying down something precious she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to touch. The dog curled deeper into the fabric, trembling in bursts. Its fur was matted with mud and rain, clumped together like the tangled strands of Lily's hair on the day she was found. It was so small it could easily fit in the palm of an adult's hand, frail, wheezing, but still alive. And for Lily, that was enough. She bent over, reached into her faded backpack, and rummaged through the silence. After a while, she pulled out a piece of dried sausage, cracked, discolored from time. She must have hidden it days ago, saving it for the right moment. Now, she pushed it gently into the dog's mouth, her hand soft and cautious, as though offering up a treasure. Then, she leaned in close, her lips just inches from the dog's ear, and whispered, barely breathing, "Don't bark. In here, quiet means safe." Her voice was so soft, so faint, it seemed to slip through every layer of silence that had hung over the house for weeks. Elliot stood frozen at the doorway. His heart missed a beat. It was the first time he had ever heard her speak, not to him, not to say hello, not to tell a story, just one sentence, spoken to a creature even smaller than she was, even more fragile, trembling just as she had once trembled in the forest. But to Elliot, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He took a slow, careful step forward, trying not to make a sound. But as he moved past a nearby table, the edge of his coat brushed against a glass cup resting near the edge. It toppled, shattering on the ground with a sharp, piercing crash. Lily flinched like she had been struck by an invisible blow. She spun around, eyes wide with panic, like a cornered animal sensing no escape. Without thinking, she jumped in front of the dog, her arms outstretched, her body trembling with such intensity. It was as if the cold wind outside had found its way inside her bones. Her voice came out, shaky and soft, dissolving into the frosty air, I'm really sorry, sir. Please, don't send him away." Elliot looked at her. The tangled, rain-soaked hair, the old dress stained with mud, the small hands clenched tight with fear. Then his eyes moved to the dog, skin and bone, wide-eyed, wet, staring up at him, not in desperation for rescue, but in a quiet plea to simply not be hurt. A heavy breath escaped Elliot's chest, slow, weighted, as if something inside him had given way. The tension on his face, at first sharp and unreadable, gradually softened, but his voice, when he spoke, came out flat and cool. "I don't want any more trouble in this house." The words were quiet, but their chill filled the room, as cold as the rain outside, as cold as the stone tiles beneath Lily's bare feet, and sharp, sharp, like a thin blade, slicing through the fragile thread that had just begun to form between them. Lily lowered her head. She said nothing. Her hands stayed wrapped tightly around the dog. Elliot turned away and started walking. 1 step, 2 steps, nearing the door. Then, behind him, a voice called out, the gentle, steady voice of his assistant, the woman who had quietly watched over Lily from the very beginning. "Mr. Grayson, sometimes the thing that connects 2 broken hearts isn't even human." Elliot froze mid-step. He didn't turn around. He stood still for a long, quiet moment. Then, without a word, he continued walking. But this time, his feet moved on their own, while his heart remained behind, left in that room beside the little girl and the tiny creature who only wanted to be allowed to stay alive. That evening, the kitchen in Elliot's sprawling mansion no longer felt as cold and empty as it usually did. The soft golden glow from an antique hanging lamp spilled gently across the wooden table, slid through the gaps in the cabinets, and came to rest on the tall figure standing by the stove. Elliot was still dressed in his usual dark suit, but his tie had been loosened, the collar of his shirt slightly rumpled, and his sleeves rolled up past his elbows. In his hands, he held a clean cotton towel and a steaming bowl of milk. He didn't know how much the tiny creature downstairs would be able to drink, but at that moment, an old memory surged up from somewhere deep within him, unbidden, vivid. He had once been a nameless boy in an orphanage, so hungry he no longer had the strength to cry, curled up and shivering against a cold, cracked wall. One day, a woman, a stranger he never saw again, had passed through the kitchen, and without asking for his name or staying long enough to say anything, had pressed half a cup of warm milk into his trembling hands. She hadn't stayed. She hadn't said a word. But that feeling of someone, anyone, giving him something to survive on, no matter how small, was the first time in his life he had realized he wasn't entirely invisible. And tonight, Elliot was repeating that simple, wordless act. Not for himself, but for another soul, a soul fighting just as hard to survive in a world that had met her with nothing but silence and cruelty. He carried the tray carefully down to the ground floor. The laundry room, tucked beside the garage, a place rarely visited, had now become a temporary shelter for the little puppy Lily had saved. The door was ajar. Light from the hallway spilled into the room, brushing over a sight that made Elliot's heart tighten. Lily was curled up in a corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her back pressed against the wall. A large, threadbare blanket was wrapped around her frail frame, almost swallowing her whole. In her arms, the tiny dog nestled close against her chest, its breathing shallow but steady. Elliot said nothing. He didn't knock. He simply knelt down and quietly placed the tray on the cold, tiled floor. On the tray sat the warm bowl of milk and the clean towel. No explanations, no grand gestures, only a fleeting glance, his eyes lingering softly on Lily for a few seconds, then moving away. In that moment, for the first time since Lily had arrived, she didn't look away. She didn't cower. She didn't lower her head. She looked at him, straight on, slow and steady, like a still lake after a long storm, barely daring to reflect the light again. There was no smile, but in that gaze, something shifted, just a little, like a door cracking open wide enough for a sliver of light to slip in after months spent drowning in darkness. A few days later, Elliot was passing by the living room late in the afternoon. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but a soft murmur from within caught his attention and made him stop in his tracks. Remember, if you eat too much, make noise or bother anyone, you'll be thrown out. Just like me. A simple sentence. On the surface, it sounded almost harmless, but when the last two words slipped out, just like me, they didn't just warn a small puppy about behaving. They cracked open a doorway to a nightmare Lily had never dared to speak aloud. A fragment of her pain, laid bare without her even realizing it. Elliot stood frozen, as if someone had punched him straight in the chest. Without hesitation, he crossed the distance in a few long strides, his hand pushing the door open without knocking. Lily, the little girl, flinched. She turned sharply, instinctively clutching Shadow to her chest, her wide eyes avoiding Elliot's gaze, with the kind of reflex etched deep into her bones. Never look an adult in the eye. Never speak first. Never draw attention. Those were survival lessons she had learned through blood, through tears, through bruises. Elliot didn't move closer. Instead, he knelt down, placing one hand on the floor, maintaining a distance just far enough not to frighten her, but close enough for Lily to understand that he genuinely wanted to listen. So, you eat so little and stay silent because you're afraid I'll throw you out too. His voice was low, unpressuring, like an invitation to a door she had kept sealed for so long. Lily remained silent. After a moment, as if weighing whether the truth was safe to reveal, she gave a small nod. Before, because I ate too much or didn't listen. My stepfather locked me in the storage room. No lights, no water. Sometimes, for days, just because I dropped a glass. She didn't say much, but each word was like a needle, piercing into the dense layer of memories Elliot had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Elliot closed his eyes. He couldn't speak right away. His breath sank low and his hand pressed against the floor, as if anchoring himself against the weight that had just settled heavily onto his chest. "Don't do that, Lily," he finally whispered. "No one will throw you away here just because you eat too much or speak out. Your stepfather was wrong. You should eat whatever you want, say whatever you feel like saying." His voice had lost its usual sharpness, the clipped, measured tone of a man who commanded million-dollar negotiations. Instead, it was soft now, like a cloth that had been soaked too long in water, drenched, limp, worn thin by time. "I was abandoned too," Elliot continued, his voice barely louder than a breath. "When I was very small, left behind in an orphanage without even a name. No one remembered my birthday. No one wanted to hold me. No one waited for me to come home. I grew up by learning to hide my tears at night, and by teaching myself not to hope anyone would ever come for me." Slowly, Lily turned to look at him. Her clear eyes shimmered, not with fear, nor with caution, but with something else, something raw and real, something only two people who had survived the same abyss could recognize in each other. "So, you were locked up too?" The question slipped out, almost more of a whisper than a real inquiry. Elliot nodded. "Yes, but not locked in a room. I was locked inside my own heart, and it took me a very long time to find the way out." They sat there for a while, silence thick but no longer oppressive between them. Then, Lily's voice floated into the space, uncertain if it was a thought, a confession, or simply words escaping from a place that had been closed off for too long. "I think you're like the little window in my room." Elliot frowned slightly, puzzled. Lily tilted her head, her voice still soft as a breath. "It's tiny, but when it opens, there's light. Just a little bit, but enough to let me know that outside, there's something different than inside." He froze. A shiver ran down his spine, not because of the words, but because of what they meant. The realization that a little girl, trapped in darkness for so long, could still be the one to show him where the light had always been waiting, just outside, if only he had dared to open the door. He wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, in that fragile, quiet moment, Elliot understood. The child sitting in front of him wasn't just someone who needed saving. She was saving him too, patching together the parts of his heart that had long since forgotten how to beat for anyone else. Slowly, Elliot lowered his head, a faint smile forming at the corners of his lips, one hand still pressing against the cold floor, as if steadying the fragile breath rising again in his chest, the part he thought had gone numb forever. His eyes now were no longer the eyes of a billionaire, no longer those of a guardian, no longer even those of a wounded man. They were the eyes of a man making a promise, one he had never dared make before. "I'll get you out of that cage, Lily," he said softly, "not just by opening the door, but by grabbing your hand and running as fast as we can, to a place where no one will shout at you, no one will punish you for dropping a glass or saying the wrong thing. A place where you are allowed to exist, allowed to make noise, allowed to laugh as loud as you want." Lily didn't answer, but she nodded, slowly, carefully, as if letting herself believe. In her arms, Shadow breathed steadily. Between them, there were no signatures, no legal papers, no formal agreements. But in that moment, on the cold floor, beneath the faint, flickering light, with the soft breathing of a tiny dog between them, something had been bound. Forever. One day, just as sunlight brushed the stone steps leading to the mansion, a luxurious car quietly rolled to a stop at the gate. The engine purred smoothly, but its silence was chilling, like a bad omen. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out, her hair elaborately curled, her body wrapped in a form-fitting black dress that stained the daylight like spilled ink. Her lips were a glaring bloody red, and her eyes carried a hollow weariness, cold enough to make one shiver. There was no tenderness in her posture, no hesitation, no warmth. It was Lorna. The biological mother Lily had nearly erased from memory. How many years had passed? No phone calls, no letters, no birthday gifts, not a single whispered, "I love you." In Lily's mind, her mother was little more than a wisp of smoke, fading into the smell of alcohol, the sound of shouting, and endless nights swallowed in darkness, without a hand to hold. Yet today, she stood there, in front of the gate that Elliot had thought was an unbreachable fortress for Lily. In Lorna's hand was a thick folder wrapped in luxurious leather, and on her lips was a smile so counterfeit that even a child could see through it. "I'm her biological mother," she said, her tone almost bored. "I've come to take her back." It was spoken as if she were reclaiming a long-lost object, not a child. Elliot didn't move. His hand gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It wasn't anger that paralyzed him. It was fear, a primal kind of fear that no money, no power could ever banish. The helpless fear of standing powerless before the cold, indifferent machinery of the law. Lorna tilted her head with a smirk, her gaze dripping with disdain as she studied him, then chuckled dryly. "The media's loving it, aren't they? Orphan girl saved by a billionaire. A real-life fairy tale." She gave a mocking shrug. "Too bad fairy tales don't last. Elliot forced himself to keep his voice steady, though his gaze darkened like gathering storm clouds. "You're not here for Lily," he said coldly. "You're here for what Lily can bring you. Fame, public sympathy, lucrative donations. A child reduced from a living being into a marketable commodity." Lorna laughed, a brittle, grating sound that cracked through the open courtyard. "So what?" she spat. "Who are you to lecture me about being a mother? Just some lonely old man trying to buy affection with dirty money?" Each word hit Elliot like a blow, but he didn't respond. His focus wasn't on her, it was on the small figure trembling beside him. Lily, who had only just learned to smile again, who had only just dared to lift her face to the sunlight, was now trembling like a brittle leaf caught in a storm. She clung to Elliot's leg, retreating step by step until she was almost completely hidden behind him. Her voice, broken into sobs, barely made it past her lips. "I don't want to go back. I don't want to live with her. Please don't let her take me. Please." Every word sliced deeper into Elliot's heart. He didn't think. He didn't strategize. He simply knelt down and pulled the little girl into his arms, holding her tightly, as if by sheer will he could shield her from the world. "Lily, listen to me," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You're not going anywhere. I promise." His words trembled as much as his hands, broken and raw, stripped of every armor he had once worn. Up above them, Lorna remained unmoved, still as a ghost, her smile sharpening into a victorious sneer. "Wait and see," she hissed. "The court will decide, not you." She spun around, her black dress sweeping the ground behind her, the sharp click of her heels striking the stone like hammer blows against Elliot's chest. The car started with a low growl, then rolled away, leaving behind a trail of dust and a suffocating dread that seeped into every brick and every breath of the mansion. In Elliot's arms, Lily continued to sob, her small hands clinging desperately to his jacket as though it were the last piece of solid ground left in a world about to collapse. And Elliot understood. The real battle had only just begun. And so, the legal battle began. The courtroom felt shrouded in a fog of despair. Harsh white light fell upon the faces of two people sitting side by side. A little girl with tangled hair and red, swollen eyes, and a man with broad shoulders that trembled uncontrollably. Then, in that cold and lifeless room, the judge's voice rang out, emotionless and final, extinguishing the last glimmer of hope. Custody of Lily Rose Grayson will be awarded to her biological mother, Ms. Lorna Hart Bang. The gavel struck, softly, but in Elliot's heart, it was the sound of thunder. Lily didn't fully understand the law, but she understood one thing. Today, she was being torn away from the only person who had ever held her through a nightmare. She turned to Elliot, tears already pooling in her eyes, her voice trembling. "They're lying, right? I don't have to go. Do I, Uncle? I don't... Right?" Elliot opened his mouth, but his throat felt like it was crushed under stone. He couldn't speak. His hand clutched hers tightly, his knuckles pale. "I'm your child, right?" Lily's voice cracked like glass being shattered. Elliot bowed his head. The helplessness choked him. He wanted to scream to the world, wanted to give up everything, money, fame, power, just to keep her with him. "Lily, no. Please, Your Honor, reconsider." The man who always appeared strong and reserved was now trembling, his hands clasped together as he begged the judge, his eyes gradually blurring with tears. "I don't need a mother. I just need you. Please, I only need Elliot. Just... Dad." Elliot choked on his breath. I know, Lily. But I'm helpless. They won't let me keep you." The word Dad, spoken for the first time, was so heart-wrenching. like a flickering candle caught in the wind, extinguished before it even had a chance to shine. "You promised to be my dad, so please keep me." "If only things were that simple," Elliot whispered, his eyes red. "If only love was strong enough to conquer everything." A social worker approached. Lily backed away, eyes wide in panic. "Don't take me, please." Lorna stood behind with a cold stare, no trace of emotion. "I'm your mother, and you don't get to choose. You're just a bad child." Elliot stood up abruptly and shouted, "Don't say that about her. She's not bad. She just needs love." But his voice was drowned by the heavy footsteps of reality. Lily was led out of the courtroom, turning her head with every step. Her face soaked in tears, her lips quivering. Her voice grew smaller, until she couldn't speak anymore. Elliot was in so much pain, he could no longer stand. The door slammed shut. The courtroom suddenly felt empty. Elliot collapsed into the chair, his eyes blankly staring into space. No one touched him. No one dared interrupt the silent storm inside a man who once thought he had everything, until he lost the one thing that mattered most. That night, Elliot returned home, like a ghost. The mansion, once grand, became hollow. The chair where Lily used to sit and read still had the faint indent of her small frame. The pink cup she used every morning still sat in the sink, unwashed. Elliot wandered through the places she had left her traces. He stopped in front of the wall where she'd drawn with wax crayons. The final drawing, a man with salt and pepper hair and a little girl smiling brightly beside him, a large heart drawn behind them. Below the drawing, in clumsy handwriting, "The first family I ever had." In the days that followed, Elliot could only bring himself to visit Lily from afar. He didn't dare come any closer. He was afraid that if they faced each other again, the pain, for both of them, would only grow deeper than ever before. 1 month later, on a late autumn night, the rain came pouring down in sheets, and the wind howled mercilessly against the Grayson mansion's glass windows. The sky was a void, no moon, only the raw fury of thunder splitting the heavens apart. In the grand, dimly lit living room, Elliot sat alone, his figure dwarfed by the heavy shadows dancing across the walls. The fireplace still crackled with embers, painting the room in a soft, golden glow, but inside him was a tundra that no flame could thaw. On the coffee table, a small cup of cocoa remained untouched, the very one Lily used to cradle with her tiny hands, and Elliot hadn't yet found the heart to move it. He sat there, eyes glassy, staring out through the misted windows into the merciless night, whispering into the storm. Where is she now? Who's holding her hand when the thunder screams like this? His voice was hoarse, barely audible, as if afraid to disturb the fragile hope clinging to his chest. The loneliness in the room thickened with every minute that passed, stretching into something almost tangible. Then, cutting through the relentless beat of rain, a sudden, frantic pounding echoed from the front gate, so urgent it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Elliot rose to his feet with a start, frowning deeply as he hurried toward the entrance, the hem of his coat trailing behind him. As he stepped out under the heavy awning, he squinted through the downpour, and there, barely visible through the curtain of rain, was a small, trembling figure standing at the iron gate. Lily. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face, and her thin, torn dress clung desperately to her frail body. She was clutching Shadow tightly against her chest, the little dog soaked through, shivering so violently it seemed he might vanish from the cold. The sight of her nearly knocked the air from Elliot's lungs. Her bare feet were bloodied and caked with mud and gravel, her knees scraped raw, and her lips had turned a dangerous shade of blue. Her swollen eyes, almost lost beneath the bruises, lifted to meet his, with a desperation so pure it shattered whatever strength he had left. "Daddy," she rasped, her voice cracked and broken. I ran away. Because she started drinking again. Because they hit me. Because I missed you. Each word was a blade, and Elliot could do nothing but stand there for a heartbeat, feeling his heart being crushed, then torn apart. Without a second thought, he sprinted through the rain, fell to his knees before her, and threw open his arms. "Lily! My child!" He choked out, voice thick with tears he could no longer hold back. She collapsed against him, her entire body as cold and fragile as porcelain, and he wrapped his arms around her tightly, as if afraid she might slip away again. "I'm so sorry. I didn't protect you. I promised I would, and I let you fall back into that hell." His words were broken, drowning in the storm, and in the guilt that clawed mercilessly at his chest. Still trembling in his arms, Lily sobbed against his shoulder. "They locked the door. I had to climb the fence. I thought maybe if I died, it would at least be on the way back home," she whispered, each syllable a dagger. Elliot squeezed her tighter, feeling the weight of every moment she had suffered alone, every mile she had crawled just to find her way back to him. With no hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her as he turned back toward the mansion, each step heavy with the realization that he had almost lost her forever. Lily, barely conscious, murmured through cracked lips, "Daddy, can I stay? Please." Inside the house, he carried her straight to the living room, ignoring the water soaking into the floor from both of them. "This is your home," he said fiercely, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "And I will never let you go again." Gently, he sat her down on the thick rug by the fireplace, carefully wrapping her in the softest, thickest towels he could find. Shadow, too, crawled in beside her, pressing his shivering body against her side, letting out a faint whimper as if sharing her relief and exhaustion. The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering light across Lily's battered form. She didn't resist. She simply leaned into his touch, letting herself be swaddled in warmth for the first time in what must have felt like an eternity. Within moments, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into sleep, her breathing shallow but even. Elliot knelt beside her, his hands hovering over the bruises and cuts covering her small frame, aching to heal them, terrified even to brush his fingers against her skin lest he cause her more pain. For the first time in weeks, Lily slept in peace, her face finally free of fear. And beside her, Elliot remained, watching over her with a heart cracked open, vowing silently that no storm, no court, no force on earth would ever take her away again. The rain that night seemed to wash away every storm. But after the embrace in the mansion's courtyard, after Lily's choked cry of "Dad," Elliot knew their journey wasn't over. Once again, they had to fight. This time, not for a roof over their heads, but for the right to be loved, properly and completely. 3 weeks later, the court reconvened. Lily sat curled into Elliot's arms. Her white dress had been neatly pressed, her hair tied back carefully. But her eyes still held the lost look of a child who had weathered too many storms. Lorna, the biological mother, sat across from them. Her face was cold, her eyes hiding something beneath. The stepfather sat with his head bowed, occasionally glancing around nervously. The lawyers on both sides clashed fiercely. Arguments slammed into each other like swords on a battlefield. He's not the legal guardian. That woman has a criminal record for abandonment and substance abuse. No one has the right to take a child from her biological mother. Then who gave her the right to beat that child bloody? Who gave her the right to make her sleep in a shed like an animal? The judge finally turned to Elliot. "Mr. Elliot Grayson, Do you have anything to say before we make our ruling? The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Cameras panned across. Elliot stood up. He looked at no one but the little girl gripping his hand. His voice rose, slow, deep, worn. I didn't give birth to this child, but I am the one who listened to her speak in the night. I am the one who first held her when she trembled in fear. I am the one who cooked her the first breakfast she actually enjoyed. And I am the only one who ever cried when she called me Dad. He turned to the judge, his eyes calm but firm. I'm not asking to raise Lily out of pity. I don't need this court to validate our bond. I'm simply stating a fact. I am this child's father, and I will remain so. No one will hurt my daughter ever again. Lily burst into tears. She ran to him, hugging him tightly. Dad, please don't let them take me again. I'm so scared of the dark. No one said another word, only the sound of a child sobbing, clinging to the last bit of light she had left. And then, the judge's voice declared, "The court grants full custody of Lily to Mr. Elliot Grayson. Furthermore, Ms. Lorna Hart and her current husband will be held in custody pending investigation for child abuse and involvement in illegal substance trafficking." The courtroom erupted. Lily clung to Elliot's neck, crying with relief and joy. He bent down and whispered, "Let's go home, my daughter." Many years later, the mansion grounds had become a sanctuary called Where Love Lives, a home for abandoned children, souls who had once trembled through cold nights, just like Lily once did. Billionaire Elliot Grayson had passed away after battling illness. He died peacefully, his hand still clutching a small photo, a messy-haired girl holding a dog, standing at the gate in the rain that night. His funeral wasn't private, but it was filled with rows of children from all over, each placing handwritten notes on his grave. "Thank you for not turning your back on us. Because of you, I believe there are still good people in this world. You didn't know me, but your actions saved me." Amidst hundreds of white flowers, Lily knelt quietly, her hand gently brushing the headstone. "You didn't leave me, Dad. Now it's my turn not to leave the others." From that day on, Lily carried on his mission. The little girl from yesterday had become a strong woman, but her eyes still held the same gentle light that once made Elliot believe he had a reason to stay. On a rainy day, thunder echoed like the memory of a distant past. The shelter gate shook. Lily stepped outside and saw a skinny little boy holding a torn shirt, his bare feet muddy, his eyes hollow and fearful, just as hers once were. "I don't know where to go. They kicked me out. I'm really hungry, but I didn't steal anything. I swear." Lily knelt to his level, gently placed her hand on his shoulder, and smiled, just as Elliot had once done for her. "Do you want some fried eggs? My dad used to make them for me every morning." The boy nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. Lily gave his tiny hand a gentle squeeze. "You're not a burden. From now on, you have a home. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be the one who stays." The journey that Elliot once began no longer belonged to just one man. It had become a circle where every hand once held would hold another in return. There are people who don't need to be rescued. They just need someone not to abandon them. And when they are loved at the right moment, they will grow into the ones who save others. Kindness, when it is not rejected, will live forever in the hearts of those who were once victims. And they will become someone else's hero, just like Elliot was to Lily. Never hesitate to reach out and help someone, because sometimes the greatest salvation comes simply from your presence. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. We hope it has been a small flame to warm the hearts that have once been hurt, and to light in you a spark of hope for a world where no one is ever left behind.